Thanks, Sarah. Great to be part of this really wonderful event this week. So I'm a moral and political philosopher, so my work's a little bit different. I'm kind of uh, pursuing this sort of project in kind of climate ethics and business ethics with my colleague Eric Orts, also in the Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department. And we defend what we call a climate imperative for business. So, as I'm sure many of you know, a recent IPCC report says that keeping global warming under 2 degrees is going to require something like a 25% reduction in emissions by 2030 in relation to 2010 levels, and net zero emissions by 2070. And that's just for the 2 degree limit. 1.5 requires quicker reductions in net zero by about 2050. And we all know that business activity, especially from the fossil fuel sector, industrial production, meat production, and a few other industries, contributes quite a bit to current emissions levels. So if we're going to achieve the needed reductions, current practices in these and other industries are going to need to change quite significantly. So Eric and I have argued that in light of the need for these large emissions reductions, we should accept the following principle. This is what we call the climate imperative. So the principle says that business people should make decisions that in the aggregate limit their firm's greenhouse gas emissions to a level that's compatible with keeping global warming within, say, the 2 degree limit, assuming that other agents, including other firms, also comply with the requirement. So it's basically a kind of fair share view on required emissions reductions. Now, while it's pretty widely acknowledged that emissions need to be reduced dramatically and in a fairly short period of time, a lot of people in discussing the role of business have resisted drawing the conclusion that because we need to make these large reductions, some business decisions, at least some, are going to need to be made in a way that involves giving up the traditional profit maximizing aim of kind of managerial decision making. So people say things like, profit maximizing and in effect the climate imperative are really compatible. So they try to argue that, for example, fossil fuel firms, even fossil fuel firms, have more to gain by, say, quickly shifting to focusing on renewables than by continuing to do things like plan for increased oil and gas extraction over the next several decades, which is what several fossil fuel firms are in fact doing. So Eric and I think that these lines of argument are really implausible. And importantly, we think they represent a really dangerous kind of wishful thinking that promotes excessive complacency about current structures and practices of decision making. We think it's motivated by something like a desire to kind of avoid facing up to the severity of the climate threat and the deep conflict with the long-standing profit maximization paradigm for business decision making. So to see this in a little more detail, just think about what would have to be the case for the profit maximizing norm to be consistent with the climate imperative. So first, every business person aiming to maximize the profits of their firm, acting in effect with no direct concern for reducing emissions, would somehow have to generate an outcome in which aggregate emissions from all firms would fall dramatically over the next few decades. And that would just be an extraordinary coincidence. It would kind of be unbelievable if that turned out to be true, it seems to me. It seems to me there's no reason to believe that anything like the emissions reductions that are needed would happen if business people generally just continue to embrace the profit maximizing aim as kind of the central aim of decision making. General principle behind this, it's just not plausible that a whole bunch of people acting with no direct concern for the goal of reducing emissions can reasonably be relied on to contribute to the achievement of that emissions reduction goal. So briefly, one kind of response to this line of argument is to suggest that profit maximizing can be made compatible with the climate imperative as long as good public policies are implemented to shape profit maximizing business practices. So, for example, a carbon tax that appropriately prices in the social costs of emissions. So, carbon tax is a good idea. Nonetheless, this response can't save the profit maximizing norm in our world. Why is that? Well, one thing that many firms continue to do in their pursuit of profits is to actively oppose the adoption of policies like a carbon tax. Right? So if we say that they shouldn't be doing that because of the urgency of the climate crisis, then we're acknowledging that some decisions, namely whether to use company resources to actively oppose measures like a carbon tax, shouldn't be made with the profit maximizing aim alone. If, on the other hand, we say that there's nothing wrong with companies doing this because it's profit maximizing, then we're just admitting that profit maximizing conflicts with the climate imperative. So the conclusion that we should accept is that business can't continue to be conducted with profit maximizing as the central goal. The climate crisis just doesn't allow for that. So an ethical commitment among business decision makers to addressing the climate crisis, even at some, perhaps in some cases, quite substantial cost in terms of profit, is necessary in our current circumstances. All right, thanks.